I shopped around for a long time trying to decide what onboard air system I wanted to install. I knew I wanted something hard mounted and switched from inside the cab, so I eventually decided to order the ARB Twin Compressor with a metal cloak mount and an sPOD. Getting started on the install, I went ahead and drilled out the hole to 17/32 that the metal cloak instructions called for, so that the nut cert that comes with the bracket could be installed later. I also painted the freshly drilled hole with some touch-up paint so that it could be drying while I was working on other things. Next up was to loosen the passenger side nut holding the brake master cylinder to the booster, and remove the fender bolt. I test fitted the bracket and made sure it lined up easily before bolting the two halves together. Once the bracket was assembled, I attached the air compressor. And attached the manifold. I experimented with several different configurations and angles for the manifold and the fittings. After a lot of trial and error, I came up with a solution that used only the included fittings and still allowed the hood to close. I also made sure to use Teflon tape on everything. After the touch-up paint had time to dry, the nutsert was pressed into place. When installing the full assembly, I had to gently but firmly bend the AC lines closer to the engine to make enough room for the bracket to drop into place. Installing the harness was very straightforward. I just zip tied it to the existing electrical harness on the firewall. Next up was the install for the sPOD. The instructions were actually really good and I didn't have too much trouble. The sPOD isn't necessary, but I eventually planned to add additional lights to the Jeep and figured the sPOD was worth the price of convenience. I eyeballed the bracket and used a Dremel to cut the windshield trim so that the bracket would have enough room to fit. Getting the wire harness to fit behind the trim was a little bit of a challenge, but it'll eventually go in there. Feeding the wire harness through the existing grommet in the firewall was easy but difficult to see what you're doing. This position was pretty uncomfortable. The harness comes out between the brake booster and the fender. The interior portion of the sPOD install was the hardest part. Installation of the underhood parts was really simple. Power wires were routed the same way as the compressor wires. You will need to provide some 8-gauge ring terminals for the compressor power wires. To hook up the compressor to the sPOD, I just cut the included harness and wired the purple wire to positive and black to negative. You don't need to buy the separate adapter harness.